For me, growing up, Easter was all about eggs. It was all about the hunt and search for the Easter eggs and finding the surprise inside of them. My family had a tradition that we would have one single gold egg, and inside that golden egg was a prize that was better than all other of the Easter eggs. And one year when I was 6 or 7, my sister found the golden egg, and inside it was $5. She took it, closed the egg, and then hid the egg again. And several minutes later, I found it, and I was so excited because this was the first time that I found the egg first. But when I opened it, I discovered that it was empty, and I was extremely disappointed. I started to cry. I mean, for a kid, finding an egg that's empty is very disappointing. It's sad. We want to know what's inside. We want to receive that gift that's inside. But in reality, Christianity is all about the tomb being empty. When the women came that Sunday morning to anoint the body, what they discovered was that the tomb was in fact, just like that Easter egg, empty.
Well, hello and welcome to our fourth and final Lent group. Thank you for journeying with us this Lent. We really appreciate it. Patrick and I have enjoyed this immensely, and we're excited to be with you one last time. We have been walking with you through Jesus' last week, Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday. And when we finished up last week, we noticed how it seemed like it really was the end of the story. Jesus was dead. The Messianic movement was at an end. Patrick, can you pick up the story from there and tell us, how Easter connects with all that's gone before?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, like you said, when Jesus dies on the cross and he's taken down and he's buried, that was the end. I mean, if you look at the gospel accounts right after the crucifixion, you get this perplexity not only from the disciples but the women, even the way Rome and the guards and the Jewish elite react to it. They all assumed that this was going to be a close to this very at this moment a very low-key movement or potential revolt. The disciples are wondering what happened. How did we get here? How did Jesus die when we thought he was the Messiah? In fact, there's that moment where Peter kind of comes to the conclusion, well, I'll just go back and fish. And he goes back out onto the sea to go fishing. The women on Sunday morning are going to the tomb not anticipating that Jesus has risen, but to prepare his body for permanent burial. They just assumed that this was the end, and they were doing what any Jewish family would do for a loved one, preparing that body for permanent burial. The Jewish elite coming to Pontius Pilate and saying, hey, there's been questions that this man's supposed to live again. Well, we know that's not going to happen. So place guards at the tomb, not to witness a resurrection, but to ensure that the body isn't stolen. Like everything after the crucifixion, everything was coming to an end. But Easter morning happens. There is something that starts that morning. And what we read in the Gospels is this unbelievable surprise. They were not anticipating this, but it happens anyways. And so what we're going to read right now is one of the accounts of the resurrection from Luke's Gospel. Go ahead and read it, and then talk amongst yourself the different words and images that you see within this story that speak to the surprise, not only of the women, but also of the disciples.
A reading from Luke 24, 1 through 12. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. The word of the Lord.
So Patrick, I hear you saying that resurrection was a surprise back then, and N.T. Wright has done a lot of great work on this for those of you who've read his works about how they didn't have a category for resurrection back then. It was not something anyone thought would happen. So it happens, and they begin to talk about it, that he has risen from the dead. But lots of people doubted back then, and lots of people doubt today. So how do we overcome those doubts?
Well, I think there's a lot of good reasons why we can believe in the resurrection, and why we can believe that that morning the tomb was empty. And that's because the way the Gospels are written, it can only happen that way. I mean, just look at the fact that the resurrection account, the proclamation of the resurrection, predates the Gospels. You have the four Gospels. They're really, by most theologians, classified as being the last things written within the New Testament, whereas Paul's letters and the Catholic letters predate them. But if you go into Paul's writings, you see and have evidence that the early church, those first believers, started to proclaim the resurrection from the very beginning. There's that moment when Paul finally discovers and meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, and eventually he goes to Jerusalem to share what happened and to converse with Peter and some of the other disciples. And from there you get this understanding that Paul received the gospel message, and he's handing it down to the churches that he's planting throughout Europe and Asia. And so in that first letter of Corinthians, Paul writes in chapter 15, "What I have received, I'm handing down to you." And it's a lot of theologians imply that what he received was the proclamation of the resurrection, that the tomb was empty. And so we can safely assume that those early Christians believed in the resurrection within just a few years of its occurrence, if not right at the very moment which the Gospels proclaim. The second thing is Jesus dies in Jerusalem, and that's where Christianity is birthed. The first proclamation of the resurrection, the first understanding of Christian faith, comes from Jerusalem outward. So it would have been very easy for the Jewish authorities or the Roman authorities to be like, here, look, we have the body, here's Jesus, and it would have stopped right there. But because it comes from the very city Jesus dies in, we can safely assume that there was no way in which any other authorities can disprove the fact that the tomb was empty. And it's sad that we have to bring this up in this day and age, but in that culture, women's testimony was not something to really put a lot of weight in. But the Gospels all witness to the fact that the first person or the first group of people to witness the empty tomb were women. And it was the women who came back to share this news with the disciples. In that passage that you just read in Luke, we get an understanding of how little their testimony is worth, because it says that the disciples thought it was nonsense.
So you'd never write women into the story as the first witnesses unless it actually happened.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, if you want to write something and have people believe, you would usually make it a male,
like two men,
to be the witness, and then that would be more believable. But because they did not change it, and it was the women, we can only assume
it had to happen.
It had to have happened that way. And then, of course, we have in our Gospels the Jewish authorities trying to pay off the guards to say, just when anyone asks, just say his friend stole the body. I mean, that's almost a way of saying that we acknowledge that the tomb was empty, but so now we're going to explain it away. The Jewish authority spoke to the fact that we need to come up with our own reason for why this tomb is empty, not here's the body, here's the evidence that Jesus did not rise from the dead. And so a lot of theories still come up. Well, maybe the Roman guard stole the body. Maybe he wasn't really dead. Maybe his disciples really did steal the body. I mean, you can hear some of these arguments even today. But if you think about it and you really kind of wrestle with those explanations, you begin to see that they don't fit to the story. The Roman guards would have been crucified themselves if they took someone down from the cross that was alive. Once you were crucified, the only end to that was death, and the guards knew it. Their life depended upon ensuring that the criminal on that cross would have died.
And they had a custom to follow, right?
Exactly. They would break the legs to bring death a lot quicker, and then they would pierce the side into the heart to ensure that death was imminent, if not already there. So they would have no reasons to pull him down alive. They would have no reason for the body to be stolen by them. Why would you steal a body and perpetuate a story that was just going to cause trouble for the Romans anyways? And then if you look at the disciples, which is the explanation we get in Scripture, there's no real reason the disciples would steal the body, because if you go fast forward to their own demise, most of those disciples, all but one, die a martyr's death for something that they truly believed in. If they stole the body, why would you go and die and give up your life for what you already know to be a lie? Yeah. So when you think about these explanations that we still have today about why the tomb was empty, you begin to see that it doesn't make sense. The only way the story does make sense is that Jesus rose on his own power and left the tomb on his own will. And then, of course, you have in the Gospels all the different resurrection stories, all the different witnesses to the resurrection, Jesus being alive and spending time with them. Paul writes about this in his letters, that if you don't believe him, there's many other people still alive that you can go and ask for their witness and testimony. So that's just 5 reasons, but there's other reasons why we come to believe personally in the resurrection, because Jesus interacts and has a relationship with us. So why don't you guys take some time now and share reasons why you believe in the resurrection and how you come to know that Jesus is alive today.
Okay, so we've established that the resurrection was unexpected, Easter was unexpected. We've talked about really solid reasons that overcome our doubts about the resurrection. But what does it all mean? I mean, because on Easter Sunday, it could just be about the eggs and the candy and the warm, fuzzy feeling, and that, unfortunately, that idea that we're all caterpillars and someday, because of resurrection, we'll blossom into butterflies.
which is kind of the Easter that I grew up with.
Did I just say that? I mean, you hear that in sermons, though. I mean, actual Easter sermons. So what does it mean? I mean, when people come in here on Easter Sunday, what kind of message do we want them to hear?
Okay. Well, to try to answer that question in just a few moments, you really can't do it justice, but I can try. One of the things that we see from beginning to end in God's story is this idea of redemption, this idea that God brings back liberation and freedom and restoration, all the wrongs God rights. Mm-hmm. And we also see in Scripture that God's about beginnings. And so at the beginning of his story, you have how God created everything. And here in Holy Week and Easter, you have parallel images of creation here in this week, where you begin to understand that this is God's way of recreating, righting the wrongs that have been done, and reestablishing the Eden in which God created originally.
So a week of creation in the Bible, a week of recreation.
And there's a lot of similarities between these weeks, right? Just think about how on the sixth day, after everything was created, God sits back and looks at everything and says, it's very good. Mm-hmm. And then he stops. And then on the sixth day of Holy Week, Friday, Good Friday, we have Jesus looking down from the cross, and what does he say? It is finished. Mm-hmm. And he breathes his last and dies. And then on the seventh day of creation, the Sabbath is the day in which God rests. Holy Saturday in the week of Holy Week is this understanding that God remains silent, right? He's in the tomb. He's resting. And what you see in the Passion Week is you have order becoming more chaos in the death of Jesus. We go, in our liturgies over the week, we go from light into darkness. And then the Easter Vigil, which begins on the evening of Holy Saturday, we start in darkness. We are kind of in the midst of that chaos. And it's only when light comes back and the great proclamation of Easter, Christ is risen, do we see that new creation's beginning. What is the first thing God says at the beginning of Genesis when he's beginning to create? Let there be light. And we use that imagery here at the Easter Vigil to emphasize the fact that in the resurrection is God's way of recreating what was broken, what was wrong, and making it redeemed and right.
That's great. I was talking to another minister recently who said to me that the Easter Vigil is the event that all the rest of our services the rest of the year are trying to explain. Oh, yeah. Like, it is, for the first Christians, this was the core event. It was the core worship service. It was the big deal.
Oh, yeah.
And everything else was derivative of the Easter Vigil. So we hope that you'll join us for the Easter Vigil service.
It is the one service where you have the whole telling of God's story in its major parts.
Yes.
Going from creation through Noah and the flood, through the Exodus, the prophets, and its proclamations of Jesus. And then, of course, you get the Easter message of Jesus rising again and bringing life to everything that is broken. One of the things that just strikes me about that service is the prophecy in Ezekiel where we hear, can life come back to these dry bones? And then just shortly after that, we proclaim that is very true.
That's what's happened, yeah.
So take some time. We're going to read the creation story for you, and just take some time in your group to reflect the parallelism between Holy Week and the actions that Jesus does throughout the entire week, ending here on Easter, and how that reflects, proclaims, and even changes how God's creating a new world and a new Eden.
A reading from Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. The word of the Lord.
for one closing last thought, I wanted to read the very end of the Bible, the last words we get from Jesus. It's actually the last thing that God leaves us in the story of the Bible. And I think it's fitting to how we see the resurrection and new creation. This comes from Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard the voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making everything new."
I love that passage. So often read at funerals because that word new, it also means renew. And so those who've gone into the near presence of the Lord after they die, they're renewed. Yeah. They're made new.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Happy Easter, everyone. God bless you.
We look forward to having you with us for Palm Sunday, Tenebrae on Tuesday, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday service, Easter Vigil, and of course, Easter Sunday. And we will be having 4 services on Easter Sunday. Father Patrick will be leading the 6 a.m. sunrise service on the beach with a baptism.
In the water?
In the water, in the ocean front. We'll have a 7:45, a 9, and a 10:45 here at the church. See you soon. All right.
Awesome.